So, yep, there's a little note about the recording. Perfect. So for our agenda for today, so for the presentation for the rest of our session, we're going to spend about 10 minutes overviewing the grant's purpose, how the funding rounds will work, and also the multilingual accessibility. Then we'll move into the nitty-gritty of the application process for about 10 to 15 minutes. So thinking about everything from preparing to apply to the minute you hit the submit button, through the evaluation and awarding process. And then we'll kind of wrap up thinking about our application help. So our information sessions like today, and also weekly office hours. And then we've budgeted a pretty good amount of time for Q&A, which we we'll jump into then. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please add them to the chat. Kat will be monitoring the chat space throughout the presentation and be compiling questions. So yes, use the chat function throughout the presentation. Okay, so to start, we'll look at the overview portion of the presentation. Next slide, please. So for the grant purpose, the purpose of the grant is to reduce air pollution and carbon emissions in Boston, in particular for this grant at the neighborhood and community levels. There's several reasons why this is important. One of those being the disproportionate impact that air pollution has in different parts of Boston. So air pollution affects all of us, but it also affects some of our communities more than others. This can include communities that are located near highways or other major transportation infrastructure, and it also includes socially vulnerable populations. And these can include people of color, older residents, children, people with chronic illnesses, and so on. There are also health and environmental impacts. So air pollution contributes to higher rates of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases like asthma, and has also, in this recent time that we're in, been linked to higher COVID-19 mortality rates. So definitely emphasizing the importance of it there. Some air pollutants like methane and carbon dioxide are also greenhouse gases, and they increase the retention of heat in the atmosphere, which means that the effects of climate change in Boston can include things like greater flooding, more intense storms, and also frequent and intense heat waves. So but with all that, there are also ways to improve, which we can see kind of starting to get outlined on the right, which is the core goal of this grant, is to uplift and bring visibility to community-driven projects that reduce air pollution and carbon emissions. So there are some broad ways to think about improving air quality, like eliminating sources of pollution, shifting from polluting to clean energy sources, improving indoor air quality with filters, and also education and awareness. More specifically, on the right side of the slide, you can see what we will be looking for in awarded projects. So projects that reduce air pollution and carbon emissions, ones that help improve public health and combat climate change on a local level, bring visibility to community-driven projects which underscores, you know, this grant being for community and neighborhood level projects, and also support Boston's goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, while also bringing those short-term benefits to our neighborhoods. And this presentation kind of builds on itself, so we'll get a little deeper into what all of that means. But generally speaking, that's what we hope that projects will fulfill. Right. Moving into our next slide. So we're going to take just a few seconds to think about the summary of the funding that's available. So for this grant, the maximum award available to any individual, business, or nonprofit organization is going to be $50,000. You can see we made the note that the evaluation committee will consider proposals that request funding in excess of $50,000 based on potential impact. So basically, if you feel like you have a project that really needs more than $50,000, you can definitely feel like it's going to fulfill one of those goals of the grant. We're more than happy to hear it in your proposal and consider it, but also do think about being efficient and expedient with your dollars, and the 50,000 is if you're able to fulfill that. So, and also a quick note just to give context. So for this round of funding, there's $350,000 allocated for the first 3 rounds of funding. And this is through the Air Pollution Control Commission, or better known as the APCC, which administers programs that promote clean air. This grant program in particular is funded by the Pollution Abatement Fund, which supports grant program administration and pollution abatement. Correct. So moving from our funding overview to the funding rounds. So we launched the grant on April 26th, very exciting. Last Monday, and this grant is going to be a rolling submission grant program. So what that means is 2 things. First, your initial proposal submission will be reviewed during the upcoming funding round. So for example, if you submit your application between now and June 4th, your application will be reviewed during that round 1 evaluation and awarding period. Just as if you submitted your application on June 5th or June 24th or August 3rd, anytime between that June 4th and September 24th submission period, your applications would be reviewed during the round 2 evaluation and awarding period. So an important thing to note here is also, if your proposal is not selected in your initial funding round that you submitted for, and it's a viable and feasible project, it just wasn't able to be funded, it will automatically be carried over to be reviewed at the next funding round. So again, an example, if you submitted it for this round 1 submission deadline by June 4th, and your proposal wasn't selected, we will lump it in with the round 2 submissions and review it again. So essentially, your application is valid for 1 year from your submission date. I think the important thing to note is that you can see at the very end of our timeline, it says March 2022, assessing future rounds of funding. So currently we have 1 year of funding allocated for this grant, and which will be reassessed throughout the next year. But there is no guarantee of funding beyond that 3rd submission date of January 28th. So if you submit it for that last submission round, that may be your only time period for your proposal to be reviewed. And two final notes on this. We don't anticipate any of the dates changing, but if they do, that will be made accessible on the webpage. So definitely always check in if you're thinking of applying in September or in the fall or early spring, just to make sure. But that's not anticipated, but want to make a note just in case. So the grant, we decided to set it up this way to not only allot time for applicants to put their proposals together, but also to provide several opportunities for applicants to prepare, submit, and have their applications reviewed. So now thinking a little bit about our multilingual accessibility, which we're experiencing with our great interpreters today. The grant application and all its related materials and processes will either be translated or have interpretation services available. So all the related materials have been translated into the languages you see on the screen. So English, Spanish, Haitian Creole, traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cape Verdean Creole. And these languages were based off of some guidance from the Mayor's Office of Language Access. So if you don't see your preferred language, you please do email us and we will coordinate with you and our vendors to make sure the materials are translated. So you can see the email down there. It's apcc@Boston.gov. And then on the next slide, just to give you a sense of everything. So on the left is a list of the translated materials. So the application itself, which also has a budget form, the questions preview, which we'll jump into that, but that's a document that lists all of the application questions so that you can make a copy and work off of it. All the evaluation criteria has been translated, along with the partnership form, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, and also the social media toolkit, which if you would like at the very end, we can always send out so you can share this far and wide. And as for interpretation services, we have interpretation for both our information sessions. Cantonese and Spanish will be provided automatically, but if you need interpretation services, you can let us know by, again, emailing apcc@Boston.gov, and we will work to get your preferred language. So and those same services will also be made available for our weekly office hours, which we'll touch on a little bit later, and at any step of the application process, really, if you need to have a conversation. So real quick on the right, just to give a visual, the text may be a little small probably, but hopefully you can see the layout. The square on the left without the B, that's what the application form looks like. It's a Google form. So the very first page takes you to just a little bit of intro text, and then it will ask you to select your language. And once you click your language and hit next, it will take you to the application in your preferred language. Similarly, all of the translated materials. So for example, you have the application questions document below. Every language is linked. So if you click on your language, a little box will come up and you can click that and it will take you down to your portion of your language's portion of the document. And last but not least, so for this grant, not only can you review your materials in your preferred language, but we will also be accepting your applications in your preferred language. So if you prefer to submit your application in Haitian Creole or any of your preferred languages, our team here in the city will complete the necessary work to ensure that your application is able to be reviewed just as an English application would be. So that is available to anybody. So I think we can stop here for a minute and take any questions and let all of that sink in. Kat, are there any questions in the chat? Or if you would like to raise your hand, we can unmute and also ask a question.
We don't have any questions in the chat so far.
Perfect. All right, so we'll keep moving right along. We do have that question and answer section at the end. So wonderful. So next we'll look at our application process, which includes the submission, evaluation, and awarding portions. So first off, we have submissions, which I'm sure is the topic of the town currently. So foremost, we have eligibility. I know this is a little text heavy, but we wanted to get you the information that you needed, and I will verbally share it as well. But the application process, the grant is open to any individual or entity who would like to respond, including individuals, nonprofit organizations, or businesses. The projects must be located within Boston as part of the eligibility. And an important note is the city definitely encourages participation from our small, local, minority-owned, and other disadvantaged business enterprises and entities. So, and to kind of help facilitate that, along with supporting different groups coming together. I've mentioned this earlier, our partnership forum, but the city strongly encourages partnerships with and among local community groups and partners. And we know collaboration can often breed a lot of great innovation and uplifting of different ideas. So to kind of facilitate that, if you are interested in collaborating with others on a potential project, you can add your contact information to a publicly available list, and also you can also view that list if you're looking for partnerships or are kind of curious. So both those links are available on the webpage in the apply section of the webpage. So, and then finally, a note about multiple submissions. So any individual, nonprofit, or business, you can submit more than one proposal if you have several brilliant ideas or you want to just, you know, really throw your hat in the ring. However, for any one given individual, business, or nonprofit, at maximum, you'll be awarded one project per fiscal year. So. Perfect. All right. So still thinking about the submission process, but more preparing to apply on the next slide. Allison, do you mind going to the next slide for me? Thank you. Perfect. So this slide is to kind of help you frame your project, your proposal, and what you put together. So foremost is your proposal focus. So projects should, in order to be eligible, should focus on at least one of the following. So either eliminating or otherwise addressing some point sources of air pollution in Boston, be able to mitigate the negative health impacts of air pollution and air pollution emissions within Boston, enhance the ability of local communities in Boston to improve air quality and or have a measurable impact on air quality or carbon emissions within Boston. So that's kind of the go-to to go back to thinking about when you're trying to frame your proposal. We'll also touch on the evaluation criteria in a second, but the second thing to think about is your budget. So I made a mention of this earlier, but just to reiterate, the maximum awarded dollar amount is $50,000. But if you feel like you have a funding need in excess of $50,000, we will consider that based on the potential impact. And last but not least, from timeline standpoints, your project timeline, the duration of your project should fall within 1 year. But similar to the budget, if you feel like you have a proposal that needs to be in excess of 1 year, we will consider that based on impact, but just take into consideration what our general goal that we're asking for, and really assess the need to go beyond a year. And in your proposals, if you are going to exceed your budget or timeline, the maximums, make sure you explicitly state and outline the need, the why, and justification for that. And then just a few more notes on preparing to apply on the next slide. On the webpage, we provided a few resources for you to kind of help frame your proposals in the context of air pollution in Boston. So earlier we talked about that disproportionate impact, the environmental impacts that air pollution has. And so it will be helpful. These are not an exhaustive list of resources, but just some initial ones to kind of get you thinking, or if you're kind of looking for a way to route your project. So we provided the Climate Ready Boston, which is one of our city programs, Map Explorer, which looks at like heat and sea level rise, flooding, different climate concerns like that. We also have the state's Environmental Justice Viewer, which is very interesting to be able to go in and look at, and also the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC's asthma rates map, since we know asthma is a link to air pollution. So those are available to you on the webpage. We've also linked the evaluation criteria, which I'll touch on later, but you can review the criteria to get a sense of what we'll be looking for each proposal. And then last but not least, the vendor ID. So this step is really essential to help facilitate the funding portion or the awarding portion of the grant. We want that to be as efficient and expedient as possible. And so applicants doing this on the front end or at the beginning of the process will really help when it comes towards the end of the process. So in order to submit an application, you will be required to have a City of Boston vendor ID. So you can apply for one or sign up for one, I think is a better term for it. If you need to become registered for a vendor, you can do that at that link right there called Boston.gov/procurement. And if you have any questions for the online registration, we have linked the email, or you can also call the number. And again, all this information is available on the webpage, so no need to like feverishly write it down. I'll give a few seconds for anyone that wants to, but that is an important step, and you will be required to present a vendor ID in order to submit your application. And then last but not least, for this side of the application process, completing your application. So just two important notes. It is a Google form. So once you begin your application in the Google form, you will not have the option to save your work. So before you begin your application, you can preview the questions, which is what I mentioned earlier. We've created a Word document that's translated into all the languages. With every question, you'll be required to fill out on the Google form. So you can either review that and or make a copy of the Google Doc, and you can use that kind of as your template to fill out your questions and then copy and paste into the Google form. So you can do that whichever way you'd like, but we have provided the preview questions to make sure that you can have access to all the questions before you go into the actual application form to apply. And then we've been over this a little bit, but just to reiterate, so your applications are going to be accepted on a rolling basis, and we'll be reviewing these 3 times a year. So the 3 application submission deadlines, the first one, which is the upcoming, is Friday, June 4th at midnight, essentially. So anything that's beyond that, starting June 5th, will be considered for the second round. The second round deadline will be September 24th, 2021, and the third round will be January 28th, 2022. And as I noted before, we don't anticipate those second round and third round dates changing, but please check in on the website just as you get close to your submission time, just to make sure. Okay, and then to move into kind of the second phase of our application process, just to give a sense to everyone of how the evaluation process will work internally and externally. We have provided the evaluation criteria on the webpage. Again, it's translated so everyone has a sense of what we will be looking for and how we will be reviewing the projects proposals. The criteria is split into 3 different sections. So the scope of your project, what you're hoping to do, your intentions, your goals, and then the work plan. So this is kind of your deliverables or your phases, like how you envision your proposal going with your timeline and your budget. And then we're also gonna be looking at your team, including your team's background, the composition, etc. And embedded in each one of these sections, we're also, it's called out explicitly in each section. We're going to be looking at the equity of your proposal too. So there's a lot of different ways to assess equity in a project and in a project team, but that is something to take note of and be intentional about in your application. We'll also have an evaluation committee to review all the proposals that come in. So this will be a composition or a group of city employees from the Environment Department, the Boston Transportation Department, the Boston Public Health Commission, the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, and also the Mayor's Office of Equity and Inclusion. And as for the process, high level, the committee will be making the final decision on who are awarding the grants. So we will all get together, use the evaluation criteria to review and have discussions, and then be making decisions, generally speaking. So and then once that process happens, we'll give a little insight into awarding real quick. On the next slide. Yeah. Okay. So for awarding, as you saw on the timelines, we should be touching base with anybody who applied within a month to 6 weeks of the end of the funding or the submission round. So people who submit in July in June, by June, should hear from us by mid-July. So we'll be notifying awarded projects with an award letter and an email. And as I've noted before, proposals that are not selected, we will notify you, but your proposals will automatically be carried over to be evaluated in the next funding round. So if you want to opt out of that process, you can let us know at that time, but that is how things will move forward. So And then once your project has been selected, we'll definitely have a lot of conversations and be in touch to figure out the best way to move forward. But generally speaking, we would like to be seeing progress checks. So based on your project size and also how you've outlined your phasing and deliverables in your proposal, we will be kind of setting progress checkpoints that you'll have with one of our team members in your project team. And the goal of this is just to make sure that you have the resources and support that you need to accomplish your project. That's our ultimate goal, is to see the positive change that you all want to create. And also check in to have the opportunity to highlight and uplift the work. So both while your projects are in progress and completed as appropriate, we'll be working with our communications team and you to spotlight the great work that we're excited to see. And so one last, I think for the progress checks, I think that's a good point to check in. When you're framing your application, really think about where those progress checks could be very helpful or productive for you, and frame your deliverables or your phases or whatever it may be, along with your funding needs around those checkpoints as much as possible. So, and those don't have to be permanent. We will have a conversation once your projects have been awarded, but as much as possible that you can kind of be proactive and think about that, that would be very helpful. Okay, all right. And then rounding out our conversation before we jump into Q&A, question and answer, we'll just touch on our application help and support that we've outlined for this grant. So first we have our information sessions, which you've already heard about because you're participating right now. So on the next slide, it just gives a little bit of, perfect. So we have our session today on May 4th in the morning, and we also will have one Thursday, May 6th. So 2 days from now in the evening at 5:30 p.m. Both Cantonese and Spanish interpretation is automatically available for both sessions. But if you end up sharing this out, or you're letting anyone know about the information sessions, we also have language accommodations available if you email apcc@Boston.gov. Ideally today, 48 hours before, so we can help find someone, but as early as possible in any of your preferred languages. So, and as we mentioned at the very beginning, these webinars will be recorded and shared online for those who were not able to join. And on the other side of things, moving forward, starting next week, we'll start having weekly office hours, Wednesdays, 3 to 5 p.m. So you'll be able to have one-on-one technical assistance support from myself or Kat, or someone in the environment department, more than likely. These will be virtual, given our current situation with COVID, until otherwise noted. And you will be able to sign up via the webpage. Again, the webpage is your best friend. It has all the links, all the resources. We'll be using the platform Calendly to do that. But when you signed up, there is a question where you can indicate a language accommodation need. So we will, if you select a language that you need, we'll work to have an interpreter there for your office hour sessions. And sessions are allocated for 20 to 30 minutes, but we are also happy to schedule alternative times. If you email apcc@Boston.gov, if you feel like you need more time, or if you're not able to attend a Wednesday session. All right. So with that, we will move into our Q&A session. And if Allison, you can go to the next slide real quick, just to remind everyone. So you can either chat and type your question into the chat box, which the icon is at the bottom of your page, or right next to it on the left. You can also Click on participants and raise your hand in the pop-up window by either hovering on your name or at the bottom of your window to unmute and ask your question. We'll give everyone a minute. Yes, go for it, Amanda. Cat will unmute you.
Hi, Victoria. This is Amanda Clevenger from Bright Power. We are an energy consultant and general contractor based out of New York City, but we are increasingly doing a lot of work in Boston. I'm curious how the evaluation committee will determine whether or not projects can get more than $50,000 and how that will work. I think this grant could potentially be a really interesting opportunity for electrification projects, particularly in our efforts to try and get affordable housing to consider electrification projects. And so in that instance, or I guess in that use case, we would likely want to request more than 50,000. And so I'm curious if you have any guidance as to how that process will work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, Kat, you can definitely add to this. I think the evaluation committee is definitely going to try and strike the balance between finding uplifting, like community-driven local projects at the local level, but at the same point in time, we also want to see air pollution reduced and carbon emissions reduced in the city. So I think we could definitely have a conversation about exactly how much excess funding and talk about the feasibility of that. Since the budget we have this year is $350,000, we definitely want to see at least a few projects come to fruition. And so we want to be able to allocate that appropriately. But I think when we say there's always a consideration and a conversation to be had. I can't like put a specific number on it, but I think that is the general effort of the evaluation committee, is to make sure that there are several projects and that can be funded throughout this funding season, and then also that we're ensuring that there are community projects that are being uplifted and supported, so from the local level. So I think that's where we'll try and strike that balance. So that hopefully I'm just answering your question a little bit, but I'm also happy to have a conversation offline and get a better sense of what you may be looking for, so we can point you in the right direction. And then Kat, if you want to add anything, more than happy.
Yeah, part of this is also this grant program is sort of hopefully a first of many. And so part of this is also learning what kinds of projects folks in the Boston community want to be funding, what kind of clean air projects are already out there, missed opportunities currently. And so part of this is also, we're going to be learning from the applications that we receive, what demand is out there and what folks in the community are really hoping that we're putting this funding towards. So certainly take a look at the evaluation criteria, which are available on the website. Those will give you a sense of sort of how the evaluation committee is going to be looking at proposals in terms of the exact criteria in terms of sort of the scope, your work plan, the team. And so certainly being able to also partner with a local organization, since you're based out of New York City, is also going to be really important. So just take a close look at those. And as Victoria said, I think it's worth a conversation, but our hope is that this will fund more than one community-driven project.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? All questions are good questions.
Hi there. I couldn't find the raise hand thing, so I thought I'd just say something.
I'll go for it.
So I'm from a nonprofit organization here in Boston. We work much broader than Boston, but we're based here in Boston, called Earthwatch Institute. And what we have been doing in Boston for the last year or so is looking at evaluating air quality and helping to engage community members and how they can become more aware of how they can reduce their exposure and also reduce their own emissions. So we're not directly like replacing high polluting things, but we're helping with some low cost sensors that we're deploying throughout the city with some of the smaller community-based organizations we're working with, engage people around the topic, measure where the problems are greatest, which there is a limited amount of data on knowing exactly where the biggest hotspots are. So it's kind of tangential to directly reducing. So I thought I'd chime in and ask if that's a little too far out of scope, if you think it might, just your general thoughts would be really helpful.
Yeah, Kat, do you want to take that question?
I think that in that sort of situation, monitoring and sort of understanding where air quality is an issue is a big piece of the puzzle. I think what I would encourage you to think of is how that's paired with engaging people in order to take action in order to be able to then reduce air quality emissions. And so being able to point to communication campaigns that have happened in the past or similar examples of campaigns in other cities might be able to sort of help indicate what the potential impact of that initiative could have. There's a difference between, it would also be great to see it paired with a physical intervention on the ground. So if there was a partnership with another organization that then wants to take that data and use it in order to make specific decisions about sort of changing a behavior, switching out something, that would be something really interesting to see as well. So that it's not just monitoring for the sake of monitoring, but rather that it's monitoring paired with some kind of intervention.
Sure, thank you.
We have time for a few more questions if anyone has any. These have been great so far. And as Kat said, it's really helpful for us just as much as hopefully it's helpful for you to learn and hear and understand, because we definitely hope for this process to be something that's iterative and can evolve over time. So your input and questions are much appreciated. What do we have in mind for future grants? Do you mean like how we would want to allocate funding for like different realms of this, or what we kind of envision as potential projects, Amanda?
I can follow up on that, Victoria, if you want. So the question we got in the chat was, what do you have in mind for future grants? Because I had mentioned future other grant programs. What we meant there is that in this first year, so with our 3 rounds of review, we have $350,000 allocated. The intent is that we also want to be learning from this first year of grant making to understand what kinds of projects are out there and how we can sort of make this program best adapted in order to be able to meet the needs of the community and reduce air pollution in Boston's neighborhoods. And so it's referring to how we would iterate on the grant program and adapt it so that if we continue this grant program, if it's a success, if we get applications that result in meaningful work in our communities, that then we would make this an annual program, or that we would instead decide to pivot it in some way to make the grant program something slightly different. So it's essentially how we're going to continue this grant program. Our desire and our hope is that we get a lot of applications from community groups and residents and local businesses that want to reduce air pollution in Boston, and that demonstrates that there's a need for this kind of funding. If not, then we'll sort of figure out what other solutions we undertake in order to reduce air pollution in Boston. But so it's learning from this first iteration of the grant program to hopefully make it an annual occurrence. Hopefully that answers your question, Amanda.
Awesome. All right. Any other questions? If not, we can wrap up a little bit early. So just a few more notes for everybody on the next slide. So if you have a group that you would like us to present to, a community group, your organization, whatever it may be, so to provide some more details or insights, or you have a working group or community organization that you feel like this grant proposal could be an interesting conversation, we're more than happy to come out and have this conversation with you directly. So just email us at apcc@boston.gov and we can coordinate a time to come and speak with your group. And then, yeah, and then to end, I just would like to say at the very last slide, thank you for joining us today. We're all very excited to see what type of proposals come in. As Kat mentioned, this is a new venture and we're hoping a very fruitful one. So your creativity and innovation and great work that's already happening and will be happening, we're excited to see that and review that. So all the information that we went through today, including the recordings and all the materials are available at this link, boston.gov/clean-air-grant. And so that is kind of your best friend, defining all things community air grant program. And then your second best friend is to email us if you have any questions. So thank you all for being here today. Yeah, we look forward to your proposals. So thank you.